Minnesota. And perhaps most importantly, I would like to thank our co-sponsors, the Bott-Stieber Institute, Center Austria at the University of New Orleans, and also some funding from the Austrian Marshall Plan Foundation. And I should say that we are really, in many respects, we're the hosts, we're the junior partner in some ways, and would like to point out this was an initiative that was really directed initially by Gunther Bischoff and Michael Burry. So thank you very much. And I think perhaps later on they'll be talking a bit about their ideas and possible future plans for this seminar that we have today. To our guests, we thank you for coming as well, for many of you for traveling so far and risking the vagaries of Minnesota weather in April. We never know exactly what we're going to get. Fortunately, no snow and no rain right now coming down. We do have a flooded Mississippi River that you can see right behind you, and that doesn't happen often. So fortunately it's in a gorge and will not disrupt any of our plans here as well. We should also thank you, our guests, for some indulgence and patience with us. This is our first in-person conference since COVID. We should thank you for your indulgence as we work with a series of limitations, even such things as the crazy locked doors in this building that happen after 5 p.m. is part of the old COVID regime, and we're still putting up with that. We at the Center for Austrian Studies are actually going through a sort of leadership transition too, and so we're a bit short-staffed, but so thank you ahead of time. Meyer Weinschel in the back has done a terrific job putting together all the details here as well, which I think is a sort of a good way to sort of launch into some short housekeeping notes. For those of you presenting tomorrow, if you have a PowerPoint, it would be helpful if you could send it to Meyer ahead of time. That would be helpful. We will be reassembling here in this room for breakfast. Breakfast will begin at 9 a.m., so it will be at a nice, leisurely, civilized pace tomorrow, and we will begin 9:45, 9:50. We have a lot to cover tomorrow as well. Just a reminder to the speakers to stay to your allotted time, please, so we can have time for discussion afterwards, because we do want to squeeze in a lot in a short amount of time. Which I think speaks to me too. So let us get to our business at hand. I think this is a very appropriate way to relaunch in-person workshops, in-person conferences here with a reconsideration of the career of Bruno Kreisky. It goes without saying that he was one of the most influential politicians, political figures in post-war Austria, and specifically though here at the University of Minnesota, I think we could honestly say that without him, we would not be here at all, because he is so instrumental for the founding of the Center for Austrian Studies, and we'll hear more specifically about that tomorrow. And with that said, I don't think there's a more appropriate individual to begin our remarks and to begin our investigation than Professor Oliver Rathkolb, who in this audience really needs no introduction at all. Professor Rathkolb is professor of Zeitgeschichte, of contemporary history at the University of Vienna. He was the chief researcher for nearly 2 decades at the Kreisky Archives Foundation. He's connected to a number of important institutions, the founding director of the Ludwig Boltzmann Institute for European History and Public Spheres, chairperson of the House of History in Brussels. We could go on with these honors and important positions, guest professorships at Harvard and University of Chicago. In terms of Professor Rathkolb's research profile, he focuses on international and European contemporary history with an emphasis on political history, working on Austria from the late 19th century to the present. There are far too many publications to highlight. Obviously, most germane to our time today is his biography of Kreisky, his paradoxical republic, his history of post World War II Austria has gone through many different editions, and I think that the chronological scope of the book keeps expanding as new editions come out. Recently, has worked with the leader of the Hitlerjugend, Baldur von Schirach, has appeared both in English and German, and moving in a cultural direction, a new study of Karl Orff and his ties, his connections with National Socialism. So all interesting themes to explore. But in today's presentation, of course, we'll be focusing on Kreisky. And so let me hand over the podium to Professor Rathkolb for his opening remarks on Bruno Kreisky and his times.
Ladies and gentlemen, Professor Louthan, thank you so much for the kind introduction. And I will try my best to keep up with all these nice words you found about my life as a historian. I might also add that I had also the privilege to work for Bruno Kreisky personally when he retired since 1984 until his death. I would really like to thank Professor Howard Louthan and the Center for Austrian Studies at the University of Minneapolis and the co-organizers, Günther Bischoff and the University of New Orleans, as well as the Botstiber Foundation for this conference on the Austrian Social Democrat politician and Chancellor Bruno Kreisky. Within the next 45 minutes, I shall try to unearth some new aspects of the social and political framework which influenced Kreisky, and then touch on his political impact on domestic policies and international affairs. Finally, I will end with a question: what does Bruno Kreisky and his political themes and visions mean to us today? Let me start with Kreisky himself. What you will hear, if I manage this machine here, what you will hear is the first part of Bruno Kreisky dictating his memoirs. Yeah, he started in late 1984 together with the German publisher Wolfjob Siedler and the famous Hitler biographer and editor-in-chief of the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, Joachim Fest, in Vienna, dictating his life. And I thought it would be a nice start to hear Bruno Kreisky talking about his family. That machine doesn't work. I need help. We couldn't open it. It was 2, yeah.
Ja, sagen, dass ich mich in einer echt österreichischen ambivalenten Situation befinde. Ich habe die Monarchie ja nur in ihren schrecklichsten Tagen Ende des Krieges erlebt und möchte
just a few sentences from Bruno Kreisky. He describes his early memories on World War I, on the monarchy and the importance of the monarchy for him. Bruno Kreisky's roots lie, on the one hand, in the transnational culture of the Habsburg Empire and in a Jewish, educated, upwardly mobile milieu, and on the other hand, in the social democratic youth and workers' movement that sought to create a new and fairer society, a movement experienced as idealist and repeatedly glorified. Between these poles, the family roots, the monarchy, and social democracy, Kreisky was able to develop an extraordinary personalities, but sometimes also a very ambivalent personality, as I will show in a few minutes. At the same time, he was one of those few politicians who drew the strengths for new projects and ideas from total and often humiliating defeats. He was a master then of the Phoenix effect. From profound defeats, he drew strength for the future, even finding a positive reinterpretation of his, for example, imprisonment from 1935 to the middle of 1937 under the Schuschnigg dictatorship, or being remanded in the custody of the Gestapo from March to August 1938 because he had intensively promoted Schuschnigg's popular referendum, or then being forced into exile, returning with great difficulty in 1946 and being immediately sent back by his own party to Sweden because the right-wing elite around Adolf Scherf and Karl Renner didn't like these revolutionary Jewish socialists. And I could cite a large number of other examples. Kreisky frequently depicted his family socialization in his memoirs, for instance. On the other hand, there was his Jewish background. On his father's side, a family of teachers from southern Bohemia. On his mother's side, a successful family of industrialists, Felix from southern Moravia. At the same time, Kreisky always sought to present himself as a member of the upper bourgeoisie. The fact is, however, that he was actually from a petit bourgeois background that was in his family roots. His father, Max, was a successful employee, not an owner, an employee of a textiles company who managed to become its director. This company was owned by the so-called Großeinkaufsgesellschaft Österreichischer Konsumvereine, which had close ties with the Social Democrats, despite considering itself an organization above party politics. His mother, however, was really rich, Irene, born Felix, from a wealthy family from Trebich in Moravia. The reason Kreisky liked to portray himself as an upper bourgeois is connected to the fact that he could project onto the Jewish upper bourgeoisie an interesting identity for himself. On the other hand, he wasn't denying his Jewish background, while on the other hand, it allowed him to evaluate himself into another sphere, and he stuck to this line. But he never distanced himself from his Jewish family roots, in the opposite. Everyone in Austria knew that he was from a Jewish family, and later this family became relatively well off, and he maintained this lifestyle. He lived in a rented villa in the 19th district in a very representative area that in the 19th century was the home of prominent advocates to the court with close relations to the imperial household, and the famous politician and lawyer Josef Redlich also lived there. Bruno Kreisky was one of the few returning Jews after the Shoah who did all they could to pick up where they had left off in 1938. And this enabled him to overcome the trauma he no doubt felt following the Shoah. Almost 40 of his closest relatives had been killed by the National Socialists, and his favorite cousin, for example, Arthur Kreisky, was executed in Berlin-Plötzensee in 1943 as a Czech resistance fighter. Yet despite this, many years after his exile between 1938 and 1950, Kreisky was able to believe in a society in which there lived many perpetrators from the Nazi period, spectators who had been part of this system of terror and extermination, many of them not only in the former Austria, but also in the occupied territories of Europe and in the collaborating states. Kreisky's approach to National Socialism was rather atypical. He was one of its victims, having spent several months between March and August 1938 in a Gestapo jail, as I've said, having been beaten, tortured, banished, and exiled. And yet he was able to return to the Second Republic with a relatively conciliatory stance. This also stands in connection to the fact that throughout his entire life, Kreisky tried to make people enthusiastic about democracy in an enlightened sense, perhaps even try to educate them in democratic values. And he was convinced, and this is also something he repeatedly said and expressed, that it was possible to persuade former members of the Nazi Party, but also fellow travelers, to recognize the merits of democracy. Like no chancellor of the Second Republic before him, however, Kreisky faced a situation in post-war Austria in which all political structural circumstances were against him, but all social and international trends were in his favor. While he had left the Jewish community in 1931, his Jewish origins were very well known, even within the socialist workers' youth, in the underground movement, in exile, and after 1945. And he was confronted several times with concrete anti-Semitism throughout his life, even within his own party. He often used his Jewish background as a code for his self-assessment that he never would make it into the top echelons of the Social Democrats. And in the 1950s and 60s, he therefore used the metaphor, I am the best second man, who could become neither chairman of the Social Democratic Party nor federal chancellor. At the same time, in his middle school days, he already had a great aim, doing politics at any price. As a Jew and an intellectual from the allegedly upper bourgeoisie, Kreisky found himself in a double minority position and was only accepted by the Socialist Workers' Youth after much hesitation and several rejections. And he was even voted out of his district group by a putsch in Vienna, Wieden, and sent to the somewhat wilderness of Lower Austria, to Tullnerfeld, where the Christian Social Party dominated. He saw this, however, as a mission and a new opportunity, and not as a defeat. Here we have, again, this Phoenix effect. Here, too, we have also, I think, to realize that in this period, he learned one of the secrets of accumulating voters in the provinces. Since in Austria, trend-breaking national council elections are ultimately decided on the regional level and not just within the large urban centers like Vienna. And in this sense, Kreisky was really a different social democrats, because the social democrats very much in the interwar period focused on Red Vienna and the urban centers in Austria and didn't care about the provinces. From the earliest days of his youth, Kreisky was what today we could call a knowledge manager. Even in his old age, the first thing he would ask when he picked up the phone was, is there any news? He read an incredible amount, particularly during his imprisonment for illegal political activities under the Schuschnigg regime, as an edited prison diary of Kreisky demonstrates. Even before 1938, another striking trait was that he had ideas that bucked the trend and sought to put them into practice. For example, He was never a radical German nationalist. Most of the older Social Democrats were pan-Germans and sought the Anschluss at any price. Rather, he always saw himself as a product of the melting pot that was once the Austro-Hungarian Empire as an Austrian. And this was, moreover, an important prerequisite for his thinking in transnational contexts, which also transcended the Central European cultural spheres as early as the 1930s. He took an interest in the anti-colonial movement and the Socialist International. His anti-Zionist stance also took root in this period. Exile in Sweden strengthened his feeling of Austria, which was a different Austria, like the majority of party leaders until 1943 thought, even in exile, because they were still keeping up the Anschluss idea. And he always, however, was interested in establishing a small state Austrian identity within the framework of Central Europe and within the international communities. Therefore, he was very active with Willy Brandt and other social democrats from all over Europe in the so-called Stockholmer Kleine Internationale, the Little International. It is no coincidence that Bruno Kreisky took just one book with him into the exile in Sweden. He took Robert Mussil's Man Without Qualities with him on his journey. I often have the feeling that in many passages, he could identify with the novel's protagonist, Ulrich. That Kreisky then rose to the top tier of politics so soon after his return in 1951 was a pure coincidence. I already have said that the party has sent him back in 1946 to Sweden to take over a diplomatic position, and it was clearly because he was a revolutionary socialist and he was a Jew. And mainly this had to do, this coincidence in 1951, with the federal president Theodor Körner, whom he served as a political secretary. In this function, he could participate in the political surefix of the social democratic elite, including the Minister of Interior, Oskar Helmer, making anti-Semitic jokes until Kreisky intervened. In 1953, Scherf selected, the Vice Chancellor and Party Chairman Adolf Scherf selected him as Secretary of State, partly to send a positive message to Körner, who was a very complicated character with whom there were different conflicts. Subsequently, Kreisky would play an important analytical and mediating role in the state treaty negotiations, above all in trying to break the Social Democrats' reluctant acceptance of neutrality. For most of the Social Democrats, neutrality in 1955 was nothing else than becoming a fellow traveler and ending up as a non-aligned pro-communist country. And he very quickly became the foreign policy mind of the Socialist Party. He would continue his career within the party in the lower Austrian wilderness in Niederösterreich, because the party of Red Vienna brutally rejected the Viennese Kreisky after 1945, and therefore he moved into the provinces, which in retrospect was a very important move and helped Kreisky in becoming chancellor. In 1956, Kreisky therefore entered parliament as St. Pölten's representative to the National Council. It's still shameful for the Viennese party, so to say. As foreign minister, Kreisky surprised the political scene and above all the electorate when he, as a young foreign minister in 1959, suddenly began to push a topic which previously always was a conservative topic, the South Tyrol question. And this became really the heart of his international activities At the United Nations, he made committed representations for the minority rights in South Tyrol and almost negotiated a solution for autonomy with Foreign Minister Saragat. In the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and he developed an independent Ministry of Foreign Affairs, he did not pursue the usual party politics. Instead, he was working very intensively with independent diplomats, but also members of the People's Party. Nevertheless, despite his growing popularity beyond social democratic voters during this period, he was repeatedly attacked in the right-wing papers as an immigrant and as a Jew. However, Bruno Kreisky was able to present himself to the public due to his specific approach to journalists in a different way. As early as the 1950s, he was regularly in touch with a core group of Austrian journalists who were integrated de facto into his political activities. I think very helpful also was that Kreisky worked as a journalist himself in Sweden for Swedish papers and understood how journalism is really performed. Unlike previous chancellors, he didn't have 100 of people doing the groundwork for him. He was preparing and preferring to be his own spokesman, as his former press officer, Johannes Kunz, reported. All press officers had a hard job, as Wolfgang Petrich maybe might let us know. In this sense, Kreisky was very Americanized and also benefited from the Kennedy era. Despite strong resistance from career diplomats, for example, he hired as foreign minister in the 1960s PR experts in the US who managed to get him access to American decision makers, including an appointment with Harry S. Truman, the former president, or even a private appointment with John F. Kennedy. Like Kennedy in the US, Kreisky also was a product of the delayed post-war rebellions that had led to the civil rights movement in America and the student and youth confrontations with their different manifestations in the European countries. In this phase, well into the 1970s, Bruno Kreisky was very pro-Atlantic, like Willy Brandt, not only as an anti-communist, but he also played, for example, an important role in planning a counter-festival to the World Communist Youth Festival in Vienna in 1959, but also as an active détente politician who made important contributions, for example, as communicator of the Soviet proposal to end the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 with the so-called Kreisky proposal, which Günter Bischoff has published in his works. And we will hear a lot tomorrow on the role of Kreisky in the Conference for Security and Cooperation in Europe. When it came to domestic politics, Kreisky was an experienced political pragmatist who cautiously weighted up society's readiness to accept reforms and supported very intensively Austrian social partnership. But he was really a media expert, while the People's Party's Chancellor Julius Raab dismissed television as a box and left it to the Social Democrats in the proportional system and the proport system. Kreisky was quick to recognize the importance of a medium that was becoming widespread in Austria in the late 1960s. In the debates with Federal Chancellor Joseph Klaus that made TV history, Kreisky dominated with his natural style, his wit, but also thanks to his commitment to expressing and analyzing complicated matters simply and clearly. Like no other chairman of the Social Democrats since 1945, Bruno Kreisky was not only able to unite the party within a few years and make full use of traditional social democratic parts of the electorate, but he also knew how to appeal to young and intellectually mobile voters not being members of the Social Democratic Party. In his speech immediately after the keenly fought election for party chairmanship, although he was not the candidate of the party presidium, and sections of the Vienna Social Democrats vigorously attacked him, even wanted to kick him out of the party, and also used anti-Semitic remarks in internal meetings. Nevertheless, he was elected, receiving no less than 70% of the party vote. Kreisky signaled a number of basic political attitudes against the one-party government of the People's Party under Chancellor Joseph Klaus. For instance, he was very much interested in bringing science into the political debate for the analysis of the conditions both in the social system and in the economic system, and had a special emphasis already on computer technology. At the same time, however, he also signaled he was ready to do ideological battle, saying he would pay special attention to the problem of automation and the associated loss of jobs. Yeah, and we are in the late 1960s. This is also something we are confronted now with artificial intelligence again. History repeats itself. In retrospect, the messages Kreisky sent out in those debates would remain the same in the years to come. Modernity on the one hand, but with a focus on the human being, scientific methods for developing political strategies, and a minimum of faithfulness to basic principles, recalling the interwar years and the great Austro-Marxists. At the same time, however, he always positioned himself as a humanist and avoided reference to the class struggle while still calling for the change of society. With a perfectly publicized expert program, Kreisky showed in the late 1960s and early 1970s that the Social Democrats knew something about economy and were prepared to actively involve experts without ties to any particular party in their fundamental considerations. This idea has been repeatedly copied to this very day, sometimes in slightly adjusted form, but the reform boom of the 1970s has not been matched by either the themes of the time or the current innovation networks. When we go back to the expert program, one of these revolutionary programs was an extensive university reform and also school and adult education programs. The justice program was developed by a working group led by the famous former Minister of Justice, Christian Broder. The concept of engaging experts was one of Kreisky's main strategies. Quote Kreisky in English, "Our party is an open party. It is open to everyone who wants to work with us," unquote. This concept also included continuing the policy to find a compromise with the Roman Catholic Church, a consistent approach by the agnostic Kreisky, and here he worked very intensively together with the later Minister of Interior, Franz Ohler, and others already in the late 1950s. Controversial questions such as the issue of abortion within the first 3 months of pregnancy were not aggressively addressed before 1970s. It was only in the years thereafter that such topics would play an important role in domestic politics, although Kreisky was very unsecure and not really sure whether this was a good idea, but especially the women inside the Social Democratic Party and outside the party really pressed hard, and Kreisky gave in. The Social Democrats' ideas on reform, complemented by a slogan on the length of universal military service shortly after the National Assembly elections, 6 months are enough, were very well received, above all in small communities formerly dominated by the People's Party, especially by the upper middle class, women, employees, and young voters followed Kreisky's arguments. The People's Party lost more than 150,000 votes to the Social Democrats, which was really quite something in small Austria. It would be wrong, however, to think that the Social Democrat Kreisky, he preferred this term Social Democrat to the official self-designation as socialist, thus was just interested in vague social reforms and did not have any ideological views. The first years of the social democratic minority and later on the one-party governments were characterized by the implementation of politically thoroughly controversial concepts. Kreisky and his ministers knew very well how to assess potential for reform affecting society as a whole and offer concrete benefits that would be tangible in the daily lives of disadvantaged social groups. For example, free school transport, free school books, open access to university. I think this is also something very important, that you make political decisions which you really feel in day-to-day life. In many cases, however, this did not involve redistribution, since all groups, independent of their income, had access to these social benefits. This also correlates with his tense interest in social partnership. It was only compensatory allowances and pensions that saw separate rises in the mid-1970s. At the same time, the election campaign slogan, Kreisky and his team, shows that a particular quality of his government was the presence of ministers with a strong professional background, a strong experience, and also partly a strong independence, such as the Minister of Justice, Christian Broder, whom Bruno Kreisky brought as a former communist until 1938, brought into the social democratic environment and then became one of his most fierceful enemies within the party, because he didn't back Kreisky in his effort to become party chairman. But nevertheless, he had to be in the cabinet. Also, Hertha Fernberg, for example, the new minister for science and research, also was a very independent personality, which had bitter fights with Bruno Kreisky. Another type of politician is the Minister for Economy and Social Economy, Josef Staribacher, who comes from the trade unions, was also a political victim of the Nazi regime, and really also very lively and likable personality. By the way, his diaries are the best source for the years 1970 to 1983. He really dictated day by day his work, and also the cabinet meetings and party meetings. And this source has been published several years ago, both by the Bruno Kreisky Archives and the Academy of Science, and is a very interesting and also very readable source, because Staribacher had quite a form of independent humor describing some of these meetings. And then the young star, the shooting star, Hannes Androsch, Minister of Finance, all these people indeed implemented several reforms in a relatively short space of time and were able to communicate these achievements. Kreisky himself could communicate equally well with all sections of the population, from university graduates, intellectuals to workers, and he enjoyed doing so, and also conveyed his great passion to all his interlocutors. A lot of information from these conversations was then actually fed into the political decision-making process. Yeah, it was some form of control Kreisky gathered also to put pressure on his ministers. The picture of Kreisky with the telephone receiver to his ear on the cover of a small booklet, Mann auf Draht, sums up this policy, I think, in a very good way. He was actually in a theoretical way available for all citizens. His telephone number was in the telephone book, and if you were lucky, he really would pick up the phone. Most of the time, the poor chauffeur Blauensteiner or other people had to take the calls. Yeah. But it was, you know, the symbolic open communication line to the public. And he also liked to chat with Blauensteiner, his chauffeur, to hear his opinions. For a long time, it was certainly not Kreisky's political aim to turn the Social Democrats into a left-wing People's Party, particularly in the course of the party's internal debate, and we will hear more about that by Matt Burke. On the new party program for 1978, the Social Democrats again sought to establish new visions, not only to placate the party's left wing, but also quite deliberately to counter the abuse of power on the part of those in government. Austrian domestic realpolitik in the late 70s and early 80s was increasingly dominated by affairs like the AKH scandal, the scandal about the General Hospital, for example. The conflict between Kreisky and the Vice Chancellor, Finance Minister, and long-standing heir, Hannes Androsch, triggered by the expansion of Androsch's tax advisor's office Consultatio, held in trust, and his tax evasion ultimately proven in court, is a prime example of Kreisky's failed attempt to push through permanent reforms in all areas of society, and particularly within the Social Democratic Party, and also hinder corruption. Now I will move to a different topic, which I think is important, and we will hear also more about that tomorrow, is history politics and history policy and the aftermath of National Socialism. During the early discussions after his return from exile in 1951, even left-wing social democrats like the member of the Viennese National Council, Karl Marx, gave Kreisky the clear message, quote, "Don't get involved in denazification policy, especially because of your Jewish origins and because you were in exile. You don't understand what we went through here," unquote. When Kreisky was vice director of Theodor Körner's cabinet, the Republic's Persilschein factory that hurriedly amnestied and exonerated former members of the Nazi Party, he sometimes felt sick when studying the files and seeing which highly culpable former Nazis and SS and SR men had been granted amnesty. He was once relatively successful because of Theodor Körner, who tried everything to hinder the integration of the VDU, the League of Independents, into the government between People's Party and Social Democrats in order to weaken the Social Democrats. The VDU presented itself quite openly as an umbrella party for former members of the Nazi Party, and in 1956 it was then transformed into the FPÖ. Even Chancellor Julius Raab wrote in his daily schedule of sheer Nazi demands during the negotiations. At the same time, Raab blamed Kreisky for the failure of the People's Party plan to integrate the VDU with recourse to anti-Semitic attributions against Kreisky. The first acid test for Kreisky concerning history policy was the press conference given by the head of the Jewish Documentation Center, Simon Wiesenthal, in 1970. Wiesenthal revealed that 5 social democratic ministers had been members of the Nazi Party, including a former SS man as Minister of Agriculture from Carinthia. Kreisky knew he now had to take a stand on history policy, and his position was unusual as actions he took. He protected all these ministers with the Nazi past, including the SS men, whom he didn't really know. But he made sure that this individual swiftly disappeared into the Carinthian backwater, while claiming for the other ministers that they had the right to act more smartly in the future, because most of them were very young when they joined the Nazi party. From the outset, Kreisky did his utmost to block critical discussion of why the odd member of the Hitler Youth was drafted as a member of the NSDAP. For Kreisky, this conflict was for the first time that he had to go on the offensive against former Nazis to avoid being labeled an anti-Austrian politician due to his Jewish background. Yeah, if you remember what I cited from Karl Marx, he was now in this political field which he should not intervene. And he also received a lot of support from right-wing circles, including former members of the NSDAP, because of his conflict with Wiesenthal and the complete protection of the former Nazi party members. But we should not forget here, of course, that until 1970, Simon Wiesenthal himself had lent his support to the silent compromise in Austrian politics in the era of history policy. Until 1970, Wiesenthal never singled out a minister as a former Nazi party member, be it a Social Democrat or be it a member of the People's Party, such as the People's Party's finance minister Reinhard Kamitz, or even the People's Party chairman Karl Schlenzer, who both have been NSDAP members. Shortly before the National Council elections of 1975, Simon Wiesenthal happened to be cleaning his office, and when suddenly he came across papers documenting that the Freedoms Party chairman Friedrich Peter was a member of an SS death squad. Before the elections, he handed these documents to Federal President Rudolf Kirchschläger in order to move him to make use of his veto in the event that the Social Democrats and the Freedom Party plan to form a coalition. But Kreisky then won the elections and no longer needed the support of the Freedoms Party. This nevertheless did not prevent Simon Wiesenthal from going public a few days after the election, again putting Kreisky under the pressure to act as he had in 1970. Bruno Kreisky saw this as another party political maneuver by Wiesenthal and turned the conflict into a highly emotionally charged acid test for history policy. Quite deliberately, in my opinion. He not only accused Wiesenthal of using mafia methods, unquote, but also implied he might have collaborated with the National Socialists in the concentration camp, which was a false accusation. On the one hand, Kreisky's actions here are certainly connected to his various arguments with Wiesenthal over the Nazi question. On the other hand, it was another of his attempts to present himself to the Austrians as a kind of protector, even defending a man with a past like Friedrich Peter's. Friedrich Peter had been a member of a unit that persecuted, tortured, and murdered countless thousands of Jews, Russian partisans, children, women, and old people. And Kreisky is plotting this out with a stroke of his pen. As it were, was also an attempt to free himself from the history policy squeeze that Simon Wiesenthal had him in. And Kreisky shielded Friedrich Peter vehemently with incredible aggression and emotionality against Simon Wiesenthal. It is also a fact that Simon Wiesenthal was acting just as a party politically as Bruno Kreisky, but ultimately that cannot undo Kreisky's escalation and a deep insult to Wiesenthal. And on the other hand, it helped Kreisky in certain right-wing voter groups. Kreisky himself, as I have said before, was repeatedly heavily attacked and defamed with anti-Semitic prejudices, but seldom allowed himself to be distracted from his political aims. That he was not always successful in this was also due to his temperament, which he tried to rein in as his permanent motto on the wall of his office, Horaz's quotation demonstrates. Quote, In hard times, no less than in prosperity, preserve equanimity, unquote. Now I move to the end of my presentation and will focus on two important or three important issues which are still, I think, relevant today. For Bruno Kreisky, foreign policy, which I unfortunately can't discuss in great detail in this talk, was also part of an attempt to construct small state Austrian identity in a larger European and international environment. It was supposed to be the foreign policy of the Austrian people in a clear difference from Germany, and Kreisky tried really to give the country, quote, a reputation that goes beyond the measure of its actual economic and political potential, unquote. In this sense, Austrian neutrality policy could not deviate too much from the current world policy and had to develop a policy in alternative scenarios. For this reason, as a Secretary of State from 53 to 58 and later as foreign minister between 1959 and 1966, and then as a federal chancellor after 1970, Kreisky made efforts at détente to prevent a potential third world war on European soil. Disarmament initiatives were just as important as the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe or Austrian policy towards its neighboring communist states. A key player in this European security policy, also in terms of how it related to Austria, was the United Nations. He also realized the Joseph Klaus government's project of creating a third seat for the UN in Vienna with the construction of the conference center in the face of strong resistance. The more international organizations were based in Vienna, the less was the danger of another military confrontation or an invasion like that of 1938. And I think this is one of the topics I will elaborate on at the end of my presentation here, that Bruno Kreisky is very much driven by his traumatic experiences in the interwar period. And the most traumatic experience was 1938, the Anschluss, because he belonged to this active group of revolutionary socialists who decided to cooperate with the Schuschnigg regime to prevent the Nazi Anschluss. And therefore, in all his political thinking, he tried to develop methods, connections, models to prevent another invasion like in 1938. Both the North-South conflict and the conflict with Israel, the Palestinians and its Arab neighbors had a direct impact from his point of view on Europe and Austria, as already was demonstrated by the oil crisis in the 1970s. In this sense, Kreisky expanded the concept of neutrality, limited to East-West affairs, and tried to expand it and include two global issues also in European security debates. Already in the late 1960s, Kreisky had tried in vain to link the Middle East policy initiatives to the project of a European détente conference. He was later much more successful in his attempt to allot European interests to the rights and problems of the Palestinians, represented then by the PLO when the oil price crisis demonstrated to Western Europe its strategic dependence on the Arab sphere. Here he was able to further develop his early initiatives from previous time. Kreisky, who was the chancellor of a small neutral country, used therefore the network of the Socialist International also for his Middle Eastern fact-finding missions and to work out on a stronger, at least symbolic basis, together with Willy Brandt, Olof Palme, and later Felipe González from Spain. And what he did was trying to act as a political entrepreneur. Policy entrepreneurs advocate new ideas, develop proposals, define and reframe problems, specify policy alternatives, and they are brokers of ideas among many political actors. He tries also as a political entrepreneur to mobilize public opinion and help set the decision-making agenda. As regards Middle Eastern policy, it was Kreisky and Brandt who prepared the ground for the PLO to be accepted as a partner in the peace talks by making skillful use of the media, by supplying relevant actors with an endless stream of information, and by exploiting personal contacts. Arafat's ambassador to Europe, Issam Sartawi, was also given access to this network and introduced also to important intermediaries, including an US ambassador, Milton Wolff. And Kreisky, and that's also, I think, an important topic, is also very much interested and always cared about the security of the State of Israel. Had it not been for the intensive communication work by Kreisky, Brandt, Palme, and the Socialist International, it could have not been developed a new forum to make the PLO acceptable as a dialogue partner, which then was worked out in Oslo, in the Oslo negotiations under the assistance and protection of the Labour Party of Norway. In the 1970s, Kreisky's, and now I move to another topic, neutrality politics and international affairs. In the 1970s, Kreisky's neutrality policy was increasingly met with criticism after the US took a tougher stance in the Cold War following the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, and above all under the Reagan administration with the Star Wars armament program. This development increasingly restricted the room of maneuver for neutral countries like Austria. Suddenly, in the early 80s, the image emerged of an anti-American Kreisky who hosted a state visit of the Libyan revolutionary leader Gaddafi, to the annoyance of the Reagan administration, and also heavily criticized increased NATO armament. In the debate concerning could Weitheim's wartime past, it was consistently argued that Kreisky's frequent criticism of the US in the late 70s had laid the foundations for the so-called Weitheim campaign. When you really analyze the sources and records, it's quite clear that there is no direct influence whatsoever on the Weitheim debate, which has quite different frameworks and also political actors, since they did not give rise to any long-term image problems, although they were probably the causes of controversies. It is rather the case that the concept of neutrality itself was increasingly criticized by the West in the course of the new confrontations between the US and the USSR in the 1980s. When Bruno Kreisky's 100th birthday came around in 2011, we have seen interesting results in public opinion polls. Even after 27 years after his resignation as federal chancellor, 59% of the Austrians consider him to have been the Second Republic's best head of government. Also, younger people under the age of 30 often associate the name Kreisky with the band name of a group of musicians that was formed in 2005. This fascination with the phenomenon of Bruno Kreisky is probably also due to his success in accelerating the democratization of Austria in the 1970s, a massive boom in economic infrastructure, including the federal provinces and rural areas, and his contribution to a more social society via simple measures as I have outlined, and also this revolutionary reform of the university system. He, however, is the architect of neutrality becoming the cornerstone of a small state Austrian identity until today, starting this policy already as Minister of Foreign Affairs in the 1960s. And I think this is also an important issue to understand that from the international point of view, neutrality is always seen as a concept of geopolitics, of international law. In the Austrian sense, this has nothing to do with international law. This has nothing to do with geopolitics. This is really the feeling of, on the one hand, being successful in social economic affairs, and at the same time, being also able to contribute to détente, to contribute to negotiations. And therefore, this concept of neutrality, as it was developed in the 1960s and then carried out also in the 1970s and early 1980s, has become so strong in Austrian public opinion that even, for example, in 2000, when the People's Party and Freedom's Party government under Chancellor Wolfgang Schüssel and Jörg Haider in the background in Carinthia informally decided to join NATO, and this didn't work because it's quite clear if you do this in Austria, you will lose the elections anyway. It's a very complex form of identity construction which has different layers, but this is also something which we might discuss in tomorrow. I come to an end. Kreisky remains, like the protagonist Ulrich of the really difficult and enormous novel of Robert Musil, a complex man with qualities, shaped by the cultural space of the Habsburg Empire and Austrian Marxism, but also by his long exile in Sweden, a fully assimilated Austrian of Jewish origin, an agnostic who built bridges with the Catholic Church, a politician by vocation who had to make many compromises with his own party and his voters in order to celebrate great victories at the ballot box and politically shape his country. Let me finish not with a classical historical remark, but with a tricky question. What's left over? Yeah, we have already mentioned one issue. This is certainly this strong views of Austrian society of being a neutral country in a very complex sense, very pro-Western, very pro-European, but at the same time still keeping up the leftovers, so to speak, of neutrality. But what else? Kreisky's political main visions concerning the positive effects of social policies and education for all, as well as international cooperation in times of geopolitical conflicts, in my opinion, still matter. Bruno Kreisky always tried to use the negative historical experiences he and his generation went through, the horrible First World War, the disaster of the interwar period and the rise of fascism in Italy, authoritarian regimes in Europe, and National Socialism in Germany and Austria. And this is something which is part of his life and also part, I think, of his trying to find political solutions for the future and to therefore advocate both active economic and social policies as well as strengthen small state identity by pushing neutrality policy during the Cold War. Kreisky realized that the economic and social disaster after 1918 and especially the negative effects of the world economic crisis of 1929 really destroyed the concept of parliamentary democracy in Austria and most other countries of Europe. Paradoxically, Ralph Dahrendorf, who predicted the end of the social democratic era, reversed, which unfortunately is never cited, reversed his position in the 1990s. And he was, and for me that's really interesting, he was suddenly following in an analysis of the negative effects of globalizations. He was following Kreisky's driving political arguments. Ralph Dahrendorf, who was really a convinced liberal European, to his heart, successful scientist, academic, and politician, Dahrendorf forecasted a new era of authoritarianism in Europe if the post-World War II successful model of different national forms of what we could call social market economy will not be continued. It is also his argument that the economic social development in Europe has been, especially as a result of neoliberalism and globalization, completely been transformed like in the interwar period on a different level, in a different framework. But nevertheless, he forecasted that if this post-World War II success story of trying to build up a social, more equal, solidaric society in Europe is completely changed, then authoritarian leaders will be the future of Europe. And he predicted an authoritarian age if European decision makers not come to terms with the success story of the post-World War II period. With this paradoxical end, to cite the scientists who predicted the end of the social democratic era, and at the same time, when analyzing globalization effects, more or less reinvented social democracy in a different form. And I think this very well fits to what was the main political vision and the main political aim of Bruno Kreisky and coming to terms with European 20th century history. Thank you so much.